The tray was always cold, even in summer, even when the kitchen ran so hot that the air above the pass shimmered. The metal serving tray stayed cold in Sarah's hands, as though the thing had been made to remind her of her place. She had worked the grand hall of Ashvane Keep for 3 years, and the tray had never once warmed to her touch. She balanced 4 goblets of dark wine along its edge, kept her eyes on the flagstone floor, and moved between the long tables the way she had trained herself to move, quietly, without disturbing the air around her, without drawing the kind of attention that led to questions she could not safely answer. The hall smelled of pine resin and roasting boar, and the particular sweetness of old stone warmed by torch fire. Nobles from 3 packs filled the benches. Their voices rose in layers, laughter over argument, over the low hum of music from the far corner. And beneath all of it, beneath every sound in that enormous room, she felt him. She always felt him before she saw him. The pull started behind her sternum, a pressure like a held breath, and she knew, without looking toward the raised dais, that Alpha King Caden Ashvane had entered the hall. She kept her eyes down. She lifted the first goblet from the tray and set it before a council lord without spilling a drop. She had spent 3 years learning how to feel that pull and not follow it. The trouble began 40 minutes into the feast, when Lord Brennan of the Eastern Ridge called for more wine and caught Sarah's arm as she turned to leave, not cruelly, but with the easy carelessness of a man who had never once considered that what he grabbed might prefer not to be grabbed. She smiled, said she would return with the bottle, and stepped back toward the kitchen corridor, directly into the path of a younger noble who was watching the dais instead of the floor. The collision was minor, the wine was not. 1 goblet tipped, the contents crossing her white service apron in a dark spreading stain, and the sound of it, the small ceramic knock of the goblet against the tray, carried in one of those sudden silences that happen in large rooms with no warning. The silence was enough. From the raised dais, Alpha King Caden Ashvane looked down at the spillage, at Sarah, at the goblet rolling to the edge of the tray, and he said something in the old tongue. The old tongue was not spoken at Ashvane Keep, not as a matter of law, but as a matter of assumption. It was a dead court language, used only in sacred rites, and, occasionally, by those with enough education and enough cruelty to weaponize the fact that most people in the room would not understand it. Caden's voice carried the words precisely, deliberately, at a volume calibrated to reach the first 3 tables. His expression did not change. Several of the high table lords laughed. A few looked down at their plates. Sarah understood every word. She was, after all, the reason the old tongue had been kept alive in the scholars' library of a pack that no longer existed. She set the tray against her hip, looked at the floor, and walked back to the kitchen without hurrying, without breaking, without allowing what she understood to show on her face. Behind her, she heard Lord Brennan say something to his neighbor in a low, amused voice. She did not hear what it was. She did not need to. The kitchen was hot and loud and smelled of grease, and no one in it had been watching the hall at that moment, and for that she was grateful. She set the tray on the pass, replaced the fallen goblet, filled it, took a long, slow breath through her nose, and went back out. That was the night everything changed. 3 years earlier, Sarah had arrived at Ashvane Keep with a borrowed name, a borrowed history, and a scar along her left collarbone that she kept covered regardless of the weather. Her real name was Seraphine of the Hollow Moon Pack, last surviving daughter of Alpha Dorian of the Hollow Moon, and she was not supposed to be alive. The Hollow Moon Pack had been dissolved. That was the official language, dissolved, as though a pack of 400 people and a territory of 600 miles were a business arrangement that had simply run its course. What had actually happened was older and uglier, and took place over the course of a single night in late autumn, when Sarah was 19 and still sleeping in the room she had grown up in, the one with the window that faced east and let in the first light every morning. She had been awoken by smoke. She had run. She had not stopped running until she crossed into neutral territory and collapsed in a pine forest 2 days later, where an old healer named Marta had found her and decided, for reasons Sarah had never fully understood, to keep her alive. Marta had given her the borrowed name, Sarah, simple, forgettable, and the borrowed history, a girl from a collapsed merchant family in the Northern Territories, no pack affiliation, no remarkable skills. Marta had looked at the scar along her collarbone and asked no questions about it. She had given Sarah a wool dress and dried meat and pointed her toward the valley where Ashvane Keep sat behind its stone walls, and she had said, "Largest staff in the region. They don't ask for references, just strong backs. Don't speak the old language, don't let anyone see you reading, and don't ever let your wolf show." Sarah had followed every instruction. For the first year, she had peeled root vegetables and carried coal, and slept in a dormitory with 11 other women, and felt nothing but the particular numbness of someone whose grief was too large to be felt all at once, and so was felt in pieces, suddenly, at inconvenient times, when she smelled pine smoke, when she heard a certain chord on a stringed instrument, when she saw a father lift a small child in the courtyard. In those moments, she pressed her thumbnail into the inside of her wrist and breathed through it, and came back to the kitchen and kept moving. In the second year, she was moved to the hall service team because she was quiet and steady and never dropped anything, and the head housekeeper, a compact woman named Elsa, valued those qualities in staff who would be visible to the court. She learned the layout of the great hall, the hierarchy of the seating, the preferences of the regular lords and ladies. She learned which nobles to avoid and why. She learned to become so unremarkable that she could stand 3 feet from a conversation and not be registered as present. And in the second year, she felt the pull for the first time. It had happened at the midwinter feast. She had been carrying a platter of roasted fowl toward the high table when Alpha King Caden Ashvane walked through the hall doors, and something inside her chest had simply stopped. Not her heart, that kept beating, faster than she would have liked, but some other thing, some mechanism she had not known was there, paused like a breath held at the top of an inhale, and she had looked up, which she never did, and she had looked at him, which she never did, and he had been looking at something else entirely, some conversation happening near the east wall, and she had stood there in the middle of the hall with a platter of roasted fowl and the absolute certain knowledge that her life had just become more complicated. She knew what it was. She had been raised to know what it was. Her mother had described the mate pull as a recognition, not a feeling, as the moment your body identifies something your mind has not yet caught up to. Her mother had said it was the finest thing in the world. Her mother was dead. Her pack was gone. And the man her wolf had just recognized as its mate was the Alpha King who controlled the territories in which her people had lived and died, the king whose court had, 3 years ago, looked at the dissolution of the Hollow Moon Pack and called it an internal matter. Sarah had set the platter down without spilling a drop, and she had spent the next 12 months deciding what to do about this, and what she had decided was nothing. She would do nothing. She would feel the pull, and she would not follow it, and she would keep her head down and her name borrowed and her scar covered, and eventually she would find a way to leave, to go somewhere no one knew what a Hollow Moon pack mark looked like, and she would build something small and quiet and survivable. That had been the plan. It had been working for a year and a half, which was perhaps why the moment in the great hall, Caden's voice in the old tongue, the laughter from the high table, the dark wine spreading across her apron, hit her somewhere she had not expected, not in her pride. she had prepared for the cost to her pride. It hit her in the place where the mate pool lived, in that hollow behind her sternum, and it hurt in a way that the cold tray and the borrowed name and the pine smoke grief had not. She had understood every word he said. He had said, in the old tongue, in a voice calibrated to carry, "These serving staff grow clumsier every season. Perhaps we should replace them with something less likely to ruin the floor." And then, a beat later, quieter but still audible to the first tables, "Though I suppose one cannot expect much from girls who have never learned how to hold anything of value." The second sentence was the one that stayed with her. In the kitchen, after the feast, after the hall had emptied and the other serving women had gone to their dormitory and Elsa had locked the supply cupboard and extinguished the main lights, Sarah sat on a stool near the cooling hearth and held her hands over the dying heat and thought, for the first time since Marta had pointed her toward this valley, about stopping. Not stopping in the permanent sense, just stopping the performance. Stopping the borrowed name, and the careful eyes, and the cold tray, and the 3-year negotiation between what she was and what she needed the world to believe she was. She was 24 years old. She was the last daughter of a dead pack. She was the unmated mate of the man who had just publicly demonstrated, in a language he believed no one around him could understand, exactly how visible she was to him, which was to say, not at all. Her wolf stirred low and restless inside her, which was also something she had learned to manage. She pressed it down. She went to bed. The next morning, Lord Brennan requested her, specifically for his guest suite's breakfast service, which was his way of apologizing for grabbing her arm without actually apologizing, and Sarah carried his breakfast tray up 3 flights of stairs with the same careful neutrality she brought to everything. She was halfway back down when she rounded a corner in the stone corridor and found the Alpha King standing in the passage, alone, which never happened. He was never alone in the corridors, always flanked by at least 2 of his guard, reading something on a folded piece of parchment. He looked up when he heard her step. His eyes were dark gold in the corridor light, and they moved over her with the assessment of a man who catalogued his staff without seeing them, and she felt the pull crack through her like a struck bell, and she pressed it down so hard she felt the effort of it in her teeth. "You're the one from last night," he said. In common tongue. Flat statement. No apology in it. "Yes, my lord," she said. "The wine." He folded the parchment. "Yes, my lord." He looked at her for a moment, the kind of look that was habit rather than interest. "You didn't flinch," he said. "Most of the staff flinch when they make an error in the hall." She held the empty tray against her side. "I've found that flinching rarely improves a situation, my lord." Something shifted in the line of his jaw, not quite surprise, but the neighbor of it. He said nothing further. He turned and walked in the direction she had come from. The corridor felt different with him gone, colder and also easier to breathe in. She told herself the exchange meant nothing. She told herself that for 9 days, and on the 10th day Lord Brennan's guest departed, and she was reassigned to the morning corridor route, the set of passages that connected the Great Hall to the South Tower, and she understood within 2 days that she was running that route at the same time Caden Ashvane walked it from his study to the council chamber, and she did not know if that was coincidence or the housekeeper's scheduling or something she did not have a name for. He stopped her twice in those 9 days. Once to ask if the cellars were managing the summer heat, an odd question, one that seemed designed to produce an answer and then have a conversation around it. Once to ask if she had ever learned any of the older court dialects, which she answered by saying she had not, which was the only lie she told him directly, and she felt it in her throat like a splinter going in the wrong direction. He was not what she had spent 3 years telling herself he was. She had built a version of him in her mind that served her purposes: cold, performative, a man who wore authority like a skin and felt nothing underneath it. The man in the corridor was careful. He was precise. He watched her in a way that was different from the high table watch, the catalog the staff watch. He watched her as though he was trying to solve something, and the solution kept moving. She recognized the look because she had felt the same confusion in reverse. She also recognized that none of this was safe. If anything, a king who was beginning to notice her was more dangerous than a king who did not, because her scar was not just a scar. It was the pack mark of the hollow moon, and it was on her collarbone where a lover or a doctor or a sharp-eyed lord would eventually see it. And if anyone with knowledge of the old pack saw it, her borrowed name and borrowed history would dissolve the way the hollow moon itself had dissolved, quickly and without recourse. She began to make plans to leave. It was the plans that undid her. Specifically, the part of the plan that required her to enter the scholars' library at night and retrieve a map of the northern roads, which was the only detailed map she knew of that showed both the neutral territories and the route toward the coast where she believed she could find passage to the free settlements. She picked the lock cleanly. She had been taught how by her father's second, who had believed all children should know practical skills, and she moved through the dark library by memory and reached the map cabinet and found the correct drawer. And Caden Ashvane was sitting at the long reading table in the dark, not 3 feet from her, with a single dim lamp and an open book. He looked at her, she looked at him. The drawer with the map was still in her hand. "The library is closed to staff after 6 bell," he said, but his voice had the quality of a question dressed as a statement. "I know," she said, because lying was not going to work, and she knew it. "Then why are you here?" She had 3 prepared answers, and none of them would survive the look he was currently giving her. The same solving look, but closer now, in the lamplight, and she felt the mate pull hit her like a door, opening into a warm room after a long time in the cold, sudden, and physical, and almost unbearable. She watched him feel something too, watched it cross his face and then get contained, the way she contained things, the practiced interior discipline of someone who had learned not to show what moved through them. He felt it, he recognized it. She watched him recognize it, and she watched him not know what to do with it, because she was a serving woman with an empty tray and her hand on a map cabinet drawer, and what he was feeling did not align with any version of this moment that made sense to him. "You should report me to Elsa," she said. "That's the protocol." "I know what the protocol is," he said. "Then, tell me your name," he said. She told him the borrowed one. He studied her face. "Where are you from?" And this was the question, the one she had deflected for 3 years, and she was tired. She recognized it in that moment as a specific and cellular tiredness, the tiredness of someone who has been holding a shape that is not their own for so long that the muscles of it are failing, and she said, without making a decision to say it, "The North." "Specific," he said. "I don't have a pack." "Everyone has a pack." "Not everyone," she said. The lamp between them burned low. He had not moved to call the guard, had not stood, had not reached for the bell pull on the wall behind him. He was looking at her with that concentrated attention that she had begun to dread and want in equal measure, and she became abruptly aware that her pulse was doing something completely outside her control, that the space between them, 6 feet, the length of the table, was simultaneously too large and not nearly large enough. "The map you're looking at," he said, "it's the northern roads." "I know what map it is. Are you planning to leave?" She thought about lying. She thought about the borrowed name and the cold tray and the sentence in the old tongue and the 9 days in the corridor, and she said, "I was. The word sat between them. He looked at her mouth when she said it, which was the most unguarded thing she had seen him do. Then he looked back at her eyes, and he said, with the precision of a man laying a very careful thing down on a table, "The words I spoke in the hall, you understood them. It was not a question." "Yes," she said. "How?" She kept the drawer closed in her hand. "My father kept the old language. He believed that things worth preserving should be actively preserved." Caden was quiet for a moment. Something passed over his face, complex and quick, that she could not entirely read. "Most of the northern pacts that maintained the old language were dissolved," he said. "Yes," she said again. This time the quiet stretched longer, and in it she felt him arrive somewhere. Not at the complete truth, not yet, but at the edge of it, at the place where the shape of things was visible, even if the details were not. "What is your name?" he said. "Your real name." And she told him. The days that followed that night were not simple, but they were different from everything before them. Different in the way that the moment after a held breath is different from the held breath itself. She did not leave. He did not report her. She kept her position on the morning corridor route, and she kept the borrowed name in all official contexts, and she wore her scar covered as she always had, and Caden Ashvane began to do something she had not anticipated. He came to find her. Not publicly, not in ways that would be registered by his court. He found her in the corridor, in the kitchen courtyard, once in the herb garden, where she went on her rest afternoon, because it smelled like the gardens of her childhood home, and she could not stay away from it. He found her, and he talked to her, not about court matters, not about pack politics, about books she had read and roads she had traveled, and what the North looked like in the first snow. About his mother, who had died when he was 12 and who had kept a garden similar to this one. About the weight of the throne, which he described not with complaint but with the precise language of a man trying to explain a thing he had never put into words before. She began to understand what she had mistaken for coldness. He was contained. He was deliberate. He had been king since he was 18, and he had learned early what unconstrained emotion looked like in a man with power. She saw it in the histories he carried from the library, in the cases he cited when he explained the council's decisions, in the way he spoke about his father's reign with a careful distance that was not admiration. His coldness was a structure he had built. It had made him fair. It had also made him alone. She recognized that loneliness. She also recognized, with increasing clarity and increasing alarm, that she was failing to be appropriately careful. She was letting him see too much. She was answering questions honestly. She was standing in herb gardens, telling the Alpha King about the eastern sky at dawn, as seen from a pack territory that was supposed to be dead and forgotten, and she was doing it because the mate pull had stopped being a pressure and started being a warmth, and she was 37 days past the night in the library, and it had been a long time since she had been warm. The morning everything broke open began like any other. She was running the corridor route, a full tray balanced on her forearm, when she heard voices ahead, two of the High Council lords, Brennan, and a man called Voss, standing at the corridor junction in conversation. She slowed, because the protocol was to wait when council members were in discussion, rather than interrupting their path. She stayed back and kept her eyes on the tray. "The Northern investigation is complete," Voss was saying. "And?" Brennan. 3 years. The Hollow Moon Pack's lands have been settled, the archives sealed. If any of the bloodlines survived the dissolution, they've not surfaced. A pause. The king signed the permanent closure order this morning. Sarah's hands stayed level. The tray stayed level. She breathed through the outside of the cold, flat way she breathed when she was containing something that would otherwise not be contained. "Good," Brennan said. The last thing he needs is a claim from some surviving daughter complicating the eastern borders. That land is Ashvane territory now. Permanently. They moved on. She waited until they were through the door at the far end of the corridor, and then she set the tray against the wall and pressed her back against the stone and did not fall apart. She had done her falling apart 3 years ago in a pine forest, and she was not going to do it again in a corridor, but she let herself feel it, the full, specific shape of what had just been said. Caden had signed the order. This morning, he had spent 37 evenings in an herb garden, telling her about his mother, and the weight of kingship, and the eastern sky, and this morning he had signed the order that permanently closed the question of whether her people, her family, her father's pack, deserved any redress. He did not know she was Hollow Moon. She had told him her name. She had not told him the rest. She had been going to tell him. She had been finding the right time for 37 days, which was too long, and now the right time was gone. She picked up the tray. She ran the corridor route. She served the morning meal in the outer hall. She did not look toward the council chamber. At noon, she was pulling clean linens from the laundry rack in the east courtyard when he appeared in the doorway, which was not where she expected him. He never came to the service courtyards. It was genuinely outside any reasonable explanation, except that he had been looking for her. "You've been avoiding the corridor," he said. "I've been doing my work," she said. He crossed the courtyard, unhurried. The linens were between them, white and hanging like a statement. "Something's wrong," he said, not as a question. "I'm fine, my lord." "You don't call me that when we're alone," he said. "You stopped 2 weeks ago, and I'd prefer you kept not calling me that." She pulled another sheet from the rack and folded it. "I heard the council conversation this morning." He was quiet. "About the Hollow Moon pack," she said. "Sarah, you signed it this morning." She folded the sheet with precision, each corner meeting exactly. Permanent closure. The lands are sealed. "That was a council decision that has been in process for 3 years," she said. "I know how long it's been in process." She set the folded sheet in the basket and turned to face him, which was something she had been careful not to do fully and directly, and she did it now because being careful was no longer the governing principle. "I know, because it started the night they burned my home." The courtyard was quiet, the kind of quiet that happens when the world adjusts to what has just been said. "You're Hollow Moon," he said. "Yes." "You're the Alpha's daughter." "Yes." The thing that crossed his face then was not what she expected. She had expected calculation, or defensiveness, or the careful composure of a man managing political information. What she saw instead was something that looked, precisely and unmistakably, like a man who had just understood the size of something he had not seen coming. "How long have you known who I was?" he said. "Since before I arrived," she said. "I came here because it was the only safe place." The dissolution of the pack was declared an internal matter, and the king's court did not investigate it, and I thought if I could stay hidden long enough, I could eventually get north, get out of the territories, start over somewhere that didn't know my name. "And then you didn't leave." "No," she said, "I didn't leave." He crossed the remaining distance between them, past the hanging linens, and she stood her ground, because she was done managing the distance. He stopped close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, close enough that the mate pull was a physical thing pressing through the front of her ribs like a hand against a door. "The order this morning," he said. "I signed it because the council presented it as a procedural close. I did not read. I did not know." He stopped. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it not as a king, but as—" "I know what you are to me," she said. "I've known for over a year." Then you know I would not have. I didn't know what you would have done, she said honestly. That was the problem. I didn't know if knowing would make you a danger to me or a protection. I didn't know which version of you was real. She looked at him directly. I know now. He reached out and touched the edge of her collar, not intrusively, a single finger against the fabric at her collarbone, and she did not move away, and he said, "May I?" She reached up and moved the fabric herself. The pack mark, the scar of the hollow moon, crescent-shaped and silver-pale, lay exposed in the afternoon light. He looked at it for a long time. She watched him put things together: the old tongue, the northern roads, the borrowed name, the 37 evenings in an herb garden. She watched him understand what she had risked, and why, and what it had cost her to risk it. "I'm going to reverse the order," he said. "That's not why I told you." "I know," he said. "I'm still going to do it." His hand moved from the collar to her jaw, the briefest possible contact, warm and careful, and asking rather than taking, and she felt the mate bond respond to the touch the way it had been waiting for a year and a half to respond. Not like a struck bell this time, but like a fire that had been banked for a long season, finally given air, spreading through her chest and along the back of her neck and down her spine with a steadiness that was the opposite of urgency, that was the feeling of something returning to what it had always been. She did not pull away. "Tell me your name," he said. "The full one, the real one." "Seraphine of the Hollow Moon," she said. His thumb moved once across her cheekbone. "I should have known you in the hall 3 years ago," he said. "My wolf knew. I felt it the first night, and I spent a year convincing myself I was wrong." "So did I," she said. "I'm done convincing myself of things," he said. "So am I." She leaned into the touch, a small movement, the admission of something she had been arguing against for more than a year. His hand curved around the back of her neck, warm and certain, and he pressed his forehead to hers with the particular reverence of a man who had learned to be careful with everything and was choosing, right now, in an east courtyard full of wet laundry, to be careful with this, above all other things. The mate bond settled between them, like a door coming gently home to its frame. She closed her eyes. She breathed him in. She let herself be warm. It was not the end of the complications. In the week that followed, Caden moved with a speed and seriousness that she had not fully anticipated, which was perhaps her own failure to account for what a man who was done convincing himself could accomplish when he turned his considerable discipline toward a new direction. He pulled the closure order from council record and held it pending further review. He requested the original investigation files on the Hollow Moon dissolution, the files that had been sealed, and he set his own archivist to examine them. He told no one why. He also did not ask her to change anything publicly, which she understood as consideration, but which also meant she was still serving corridor routes with a cold tray while he sat at the head of the high table, and the distance of that, the continued performance of it, had a different quality now. Not just the familiar loneliness of the borrowed name, the specific ache of being near and untouched and unacknowledged, of having given him the truest version of herself in a laundry courtyard and then going back to being invisible. The mate bond did not let her forget what it had felt like to be warm. 8 days after the courtyard, she was carrying the evening service through the great hall when she heard it again, the old tongue. Not from the high table, from Lord Voss, at the second table, speaking to the man beside him, his voice low enough not to carry across the hall, but not low enough to avoid the ears of someone who understood the language. He was discussing the king's sudden interest in the Northern investigation files. He was speculating about the source of the interest. He was speculating, specifically, about the staff. He had seen them, she understood. Not the courtyard. Something else. Some moment she had not been aware of. He had seen enough to wonder. She kept moving. She served the wine. She did not change her expression. Halfway through the meal, Caden raised his goblet, and the hall quieted in the way it always did when the king made a gesture toward a dress. She was standing along the near wall. She did not move. "There is a matter I have been considering for several days," Caden said, and his voice had the carrying quality of a man who had never needed to raise it to fill a room, "which I should have considered sooner, and to which I intend to give full voice tonight." She kept her eyes on the wall above the heads of the seated nobles. Her hands were still on the tray. The hollow moon pact dissolution of 3 years past was, I have come to understand upon full review of the original records, not an internal matter. It was a coordinated action carried out by parties whose interest in the northern land rights was financial rather than political, and those parties sought the approval of this court through selective and incomplete documentation. This court, relying on that documentation, declared the matter closed. He paused. The order was in error. It is reversed. The hall was very quiet. Furthermore, he said, and this was where his voice changed, not louder but lower, a different register, the register that was not king addressing court, but something underneath it, something she recognized from herb gardens and library lamplight. The hollow moon bloodline has not, in fact, ended. The last daughter of Alpha Dorian of the Hollow Moon is alive, and she is known to me, and she is, a pause of exactly 1 breath, mine. The word landed in her chest like a stone into still water, rings spreading outward. There were voices from the tables. There was the sound of Voss saying something sharp and Brennan pushing back his chair. None of it touched her because Caden was looking directly at her now. Not at the wall, not at the room, at her specifically, from across the hall, with the full declarative weight of a man who had decided what was true and was not interested in argument about it. "How could I not have known her?" he said, and his voice still carried, still clear, still for the room. "How could I have stood at the head of this hall for 3 years and not known?" She held the old language, the old knowledge, the mark of her people, and she held it in silence because this court made silence necessary. That ends tonight. She set the tray down on the side table. She did not know that she had decided to do that before she did it. Her hands were steady. "I owe you a public correction," he said, and now he was speaking to her directly, across the hall, with the entire court listening, and she understood that this was both apology and declaration, and the particular courage of a man who had spent 6 years being contained, undoing that containment in front of everyone who depended on his composure. "The words I spoke in this hall, in the old language, you heard them." "Yes," she said, and her voice was clear across the quiet room. "I heard them." "Then you know they were wrong. Not simply unkind. Wrong. You hold something of greater value than anything in this hall, and I did not see it because I was not looking with the right eyes." He stood from his chair, which was not the normal movement of a feast. Standing was a formal gesture. It changed the posture of everyone in the room. "I am looking now." She heard Lord Voss say, in the old tongue, precisely because he believed she could not understand it, "This is madness. She is a servant, a ghost of a dead pack." She turned to face him before she made the decision to speak. "Aranel and Dorn," she said, which was the old tongue for, "I hear you clearly," and then she said the rest in common tongue, because this was not a private conversation. "My pack is dead because this court looked away when it should have looked closely. I have been a servant in your king's hall for 3 years in silence, because silence was the only protection this court's failure left to me. I am the last daughter of the Hollow Moon, and I am not a ghost." The hall was so quiet she could hear the torches. Voss said nothing further. She noticed that Brennan's hand was flat on the table, in the careful posture of a man who has realized he has miscalculated something and is deciding how to proceed. Caden came down from the dais. He walked the length of the hall, past the long tables, past the watching lords and their silenced wives, and he stopped in front of her, and she looked at him, without looking down, for the first time in 3 years, and the mate bond between them was not a pressure, or a warmth, or a door opening. It was simply present, the way air is present, the way ground is present, the way the things you have always needed are present without announcement. He took her hand, not the formal gesture of a king acknowledging a subject, the simple, private gesture of a man holding the hand of the person he intends to keep, in front of everyone, without looking away. "I am not asking you to stay as a servant," he said. "I know," she said. "I am not asking you because the bond requires it." "I know that too," she said. "Then what am I asking?" She looked at him, at the dark gold eyes in the torchlight, at the careful jaw, at the face of a man who had spent 6 years alone and was not going to spend another winter that way if she chose to prevent it. She thought about the cold tray and the borrowed name, and the 37 evenings in the herb garden, and the forehead pressed to hers in a courtyard full of wet laundry, and she thought about her mother saying the mate pull was a recognition, not a feeling, and she thought about how right her mother had been. "You're asking me to let you be worthy of what I kept safe," she said. "You're asking me to stop hiding." "Yes," he said, "that exactly." She threaded her fingers through his and felt the mate bond settle deep and final, root deep, the way it was supposed to feel, not like a pull now, not like pressure or resistance, but like completion. Like the thing she had been holding in tension had finally been permitted to simply exist. "Then yes," she said, "that's my answer." The weeks that followed were not quiet, because the reversal of the Hollow Moon Order was a political event of significant consequence, and Voss and 2 other council lords challenged it through formal process, and there were 3 days of recorded hearing in which Caden's archivist laid out the original documentation and its deliberate gaps, and it emerged that the dissolution had been driven by a consortium of land interests that had paid for precisely the kind of incomplete records that had been presented to the court 3 years ago. 2 lords were removed from council. The northern land records were reopened. The surviving members of the Hollow Moon Pack, fewer than 40, scattered through neutral territories and free settlements, surviving the same way she had survived, quietly and under borrowed names, were sent formal notification through the king's own messengers that the dissolution was void and their status was restored. Sarah read every piece of documentation. Caden brought it to her before it went to council, because it was hers. The story was hers. The record was hers, and he had decided, with the quiet deliberateness she had come to understand as his most genuine quality, that she should not be informed after the fact about events that concerned her people. The morning the last document was signed and the archivist carried it from the study, she sat across the desk from Caden in the early light and felt the extraordinary, ordinary weight of not performing anything. "The survivors," she said, "when they come back to the territory, they'll need—" "I've already spoken to the land steward," he said. "The original pack grounds are in reasonable condition. Some of the outer buildings need repair. The archives are intact, sealed, but intact." "My father's library," she said. "Intact," he said again. "Every volume." She looked at her hands on the desk, her real hands, unhidden, the pack mark visible below the edge of her sleeve in the morning light. He reached across and covered them with his, warm, as it always was, certain. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Tell me." "The night in the library, when you told me your name." "Yes. I knew before you told me," he said. "Not the pack, not the specific history, but I knew you were not who you said you were. I had known for longer than I should admit. I kept finding reasons to be in corridors." He looked at her steadily. I should have pressed sooner. I should have made this court safer sooner, so that you didn't need a borrowed name for 3 years. She thought about saying it was all right, which would have been partially true and also insufficient. She said instead, "You couldn't have known what you didn't know. What you can do is what you're doing now." "It isn't enough. It's the beginning of enough," she said. "That's what starting over looks like. Not a complete accounting, just the beginning of enough." He turned her hands over in his, the pad of his thumb moving across the pack mark the way it had in the courtyard. Careful, specific, asking rather than taking. She let him look at it. She had spent 3 years keeping it covered, and she had stopped needing to, and the not needing to was a thing she was still learning to inhabit, like a room she had been given access to, but had not yet fully entered. "What do you want?" he asked. "Not the political resolution, not the pack restoration. You. What do you want?" No one had asked her that in 3 years. No one had asked her that while meaning it, while waiting for the answer with the particular quality of attention that makes a person understand they are genuinely being heard. She took her time answering. "I want the herb garden," she said. "I want access to the library at whatever hour I choose. I want the survivors of the Hollow Moon to be brought home properly, with documentation and land rights, and not as charity, but as what they are, which is a restored people." She looked at him. "And I want to stop being invisible." "Done," he said. "All of it." "You can't promise the garden," she said, and something that had been quietly developing inside her for weeks released itself as a short, real laugh. "The garden is Elsa's domain." Something warm moved across his face, the neighbor of a smile, closer than she had seen before. "I am the Alpha King," he said. "I can negotiate with Elsa." "She will negotiate back," Sarah said. "She is completely without reverence for rank." "Good," he said. "I find I prefer that quality in the people around me." She looked at him across the desk, in the morning light, with no borrowed name between them, and no cold tray in her hands, and no 3 years of careful silence pressing her into a shape that was not her own. The mate bond was simply there, as it had been on the night it first settled in the laundry courtyard, quiet and certain and root deep, and she felt, for the first time since she had run from the smoke and the burning and the pine forest and everything she had lost, that the pull was no longer directing her somewhere she could not go. It had brought her here, it had kept her here, and now here was real. The desk and the morning light and the warm hands and the face of a man who had needed to become worthy of her and had done the work of it, imperfectly and seriously, the only way anything real gets done. She stood from her chair, and he stood with her, and the last of the distance between them closed without ceremony, without announcement, in a study that smelled of old books and candle wax, with the eastern sky coming light beyond the window, the same eastern sky she had described to him in an herb garden when she was still pretending not to know what she felt. She had known what she felt. She had always known. She pressed her hand flat against his chest, over his heartbeat, and she felt the mate bond complete itself in that contact, not like something new, but like something acknowledged, the final step of a recognition that had begun on a night when a young woman, who had run from everything she loved, walked into a cold hall, carrying a cold tray, and felt, for the first time in months, the particular dangerous warmth of something she was made for. "I'm done running," she said. "I know," he said, and his arms came around her with the careful sureness that was his most honest quality, and she leaned into it without resistance, without performance, without borrowed names. Outside the window, the eastern light crept across the stones of Ashvane Keep, across the courtyard where the laundry dried on summer mornings, across the herb garden where it smelled like home, across the library where the maps of northern roads sat folded and unneeded in their cabinet drawers. Below in the great hall, the cold metal tray sat on the side table where Sarah had set it down 8 days ago, and it would not be picked up again by the same hands. She had put down the tray the same night she had stopped hiding, and neither of them had been the wrong thing to set down. The pack mark on her collarbone was visible in the morning light, silver pale and unashamed, the sign of people who had been taken and taken apart and had not, in the end, been erased. She carried it uncovered now. She intended to carry it uncovered for the rest of her life. Into the council chamber, into the restored northern lands, into whatever version of this story came next. It was not a wound, it had never been a wound, it was simply what she was, and what she was had always been enough. She was home,